I was a student at the university about almost 35, almost 40 years ago, and so I am, in many ways, as some have been saying, returning kind of to my home, very familiar with both the university and Chicago, but I haven't had that much interaction with the Assyrian community, so I'm very happy to have been invited here and to begin to get to know some of you and have conversations, and hope that that can continue beyond today. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate this afternoon. And my sort of entree into this is to talk a little bit about ongoing archaeological work. There is actually an enormous amount of archaeological exploration that's happening, or field work, specifically focusing on Assyria, and particularly the Neo-Assyrian period, which is what I'm going to focus on this afternoon. And there's no way, even in an hour, that I could do justice to that. So I'm going to focus on really just two primary areas that I've been myself directly involved in, that is reflecting both the, if you will, the heartland, or the core of Assyria, specifically in Nineveh. And then secondly, we'll talk a little bit about the, let's say, if I can put it this way, the periphery, looking into the provincial context, which is a very interesting aspect of the Assyrian imperial project, or program, if you will, work that's being done in various contexts, particularly in the West, where we're getting a better understanding of the sort of horizon, or the levels at important Western sites where we see strong and direct evidence of the Assyrian imperial presence. So I'll use that as a second example. One other thing I want to it will be a theme perhaps that comes through what I want to talk about, is also in the context of Nineveh specifically, and in the aftermath of the recent conflicts and much of the devastation of the city of Mosul. One of the points that I want to kind of convey, and this is something that I'm trying to communicate with my colleagues, my archaeological colleagues, is not only the critical importance of cultural heritage preservation, but, as I hope to illustrate this afternoon, that doesn't have to be done as a kind of either or. In fact, what we're experiencing, what has been in many ways sort of my experience over decades of archaeological fieldwork, is that these really go hand in hand, that we should be doing conservation work, cultural heritage work at the same time as we are doing our, let's say, more pure archaeological discovery and research. And often it's when we do that that we actually find some of the most exciting and perhaps most significant results of archaeological excavation. So again, I hope that that is something I can illustrate this afternoon. So the first project is to focus on work that we've begun to get involved with in Nineveh. And this is all quite recent. I began my involvement with the specific work we're doing in Mosul in the heart of the pandemic, with visits starting in 1920. Actually, the original conversations began back in already 2018, but it wasn't until late in 2020 and going into 2021 that I was actually able to make trips. It's kind of a crazy side story that I won't belabor here this afternoon. But so out of invitations from our Iraqi colleagues and other Western archaeological expeditions that were working in Mosul in the aftermath of the retaking of the city, I came and we began to explore ways that we could try and participate and help in this post-conflict environment. So I don't think I need to spend much time with this audience to talk about Nineveh, but just very quickly to emphasize that we're talking about the site that sits in eastern Mosul in the midst of a very large city of several million people, so a very dense urban environment. And of course, one of the great cities of the ancient world, and it's certainly in its peak, probably the largest city in the world at the time of the Neo-Assyrian period, with vast imperial buildings, palaces, and so forth that you can see named on the map to the right, and something in the order of 16 or 17 gates, monumental structures, etc. So I'm going to talk about really one specific gate this afternoon, the Shamash Gate, which is highlighted in this right side of the slide. But first, just to mention that in some of our conversations and consultations over the past few years, we have begun looking at the possibility of trying to help build a larger, essentially a database. I'm referring it to here as a GIS project. It's more than that, actually, but an attempt to try and build a comprehensive digital integrated resource for scholars that brings together the almost 200 years worth of excavations, if we can always call them excavations, explorations, scholarship, research. There's a vast amount of information and knowledge out there, but it's in a highly fragmented or scattered way. And so in our conversations with the State Board of Antiquities, but also with other projects and colleagues who have been working specifically within the Nineveh context, we've begun working on building this kind of baseline and this ambitious kind of long-term data building or information gathering or information system structuring project. But also, as you can see here, part of the aspiration here is also to work towards developing a kind of site management master plan for Nineveh, which I can't think of many sites that face more pressure, not just from conflict, but also from urban development, as you can see just by the slide, the map on the right, the satellite image, and the map that we produced there, given the intense urban environment that the site is located in. And in the aftermath of the retaking of the city and the rebuilding, there's enormous amount, and some of you, I know just from conversations we've already had, there's an enormous amount of construction and work going on right now. And so there's an urgent need to try and build this kind of long-term sustainable plan for the ancient site. And there's, of course, the larger and perhaps longer-term aspiration to ultimately see if we can't secure World Heritage status for the site itself. So there's actually enormous amount of archaeological work that's been going on in the site. There's a German team. You mentioned Dr. Edmonds, Stefan Mahl. The team from Heidelberg has been working particularly in the western part of the, like on Kuyunyuk, the citadel, and also at Nebi Yunus. They've done heroic work really trying to stabilize and gather the thousands and thousands of fragments of smashed and destroyed sculptures and orthostats and monumental architecture damaged during the period of ISIS control. And so they've been working, there's, like I said, numerous projects. There's been an Italian team that has worked, you can see in the northern part of the site, the red dots are some of the areas that an Italian team has been involved in excavating. And then our work has been focusing thus far in what we refer to as Area L, which you can see here. And it's one of the main gates that provided access to the city from the east, often referred to as the Erbil Gate. It's the main highway to Erbil today, and one of the main entrances into the city from the east. And that was also an area that was damaged intensively during the period of ISIS control. So here we'll talk a little bit about this project. As I said, this really came together in the aftermath of the damage and destruction that had ensued during the period of ISIS control. And I want to kind of use as a point of departure a recent article by Benjamin Ishkan and Lynn Meskel that was published just about 2 years ago, based on a survey. This is something that's still unusual in our work, where it may seem obvious, but a survey that was done with about 1,600 Moslawi residents. So trying to find a way to capture the views, the perspectives, the concerns, the values, aspirations of, in this case, the Moslawi community around the issue of post-conflict restoration. And really kind of 4 key takeaways from the survey, and it's a preliminary one. I think more work could be done. But one of the things that came out loud and clear was how much they valued their cultural heritage and wanted to see it stabilized and conserved and preserved, but not at the expense of other critical infrastructure needs, of course. They also were concerned about emphasis on non-religious monuments as opposed to religious ones. They also are very concerned that these restoration projects be integrated into the community, that they be something that's not sort of walled off from the local community, that they become a part of or embedded within the life and everyday world of the community. And fourthly, perhaps maybe most importantly, very concerned about agency, that they be directly involved in the planning, the conceptualizing, and the implementing of any kind of cultural heritage preservation work. So while we had actually begun working on this project before that article came out and the results of that survey, one of the things that that has guided us going forward is, in fact, many of those kinds of points. We have been working very closely with every level of government and also within the communities as best we can. And this survey results, I think, actually echoes some of the values that we hope have actually animated the work that we've been doing. So first of all, just a little bit of background about the site of the Shamash Gate. Probably no other gate within, or monumental structure within Nineveh is a better microcosm of the crazy and long history of not only the ancient site, but the intervening millennia of neglect and or destruction and or reconstruction that's gone on than does the Shamash Gate. So it's not only one of the more important gates from ancient Nineveh and has some of the better preservation of one of these ancient Neo-Assyrian structures, but it's also been the focus of an enormous amount of attention over the years, going back already into the 1800s with the early explorations, if I can call it that, of people like Henry Layard and Rassam and so forth. But then again, particularly in the 1960s, when there was intense efforts to try and kind of monumentalize these gates by restoring what they could of the facades and then building enormous superstructures on top of them. So our work there began in, as I said, in 2020 with initial consultations, cleaning the garbage that had accumulated, putting up a fence around the site, and then extensive consultations with the municipality, with the governorate, with the State Board of Antiquities and other communities, as is illustrated in some of these photographs. The second thing we began doing was trying to document everything, and that included the extensive set of tunnels that had been dug underneath the foundations of the Shamash Gate. One of the things that became very clear in this sort of second phase of work is that, in fact, they had tunneled primarily under the foundations of the gate, but not so much into the gate structure itself, which presented both, in a sense, an opportunity, but also a challenge. And that is that the gate structure is one of the best preserved and intact structures in all of Nineveh itself. And this became quite clear to us as we did our investigations and documentation. Here you see one of my colleagues, Dr. Stephen Batchik, with the 3D scanner, trying to map all of these tunnels. But the second part was that these tunnels, which were meant primarily, in this case, for defense, not for the kind of mining, if you will, tunneling that went on at Nebi Yunus, for example, where they were trying to find orthostats and other monumental architecture that they could extract and then sell on the antiquities market. This tunneling was primarily below the foundations, which meant that as those tunnels begin to collapse, they become a huge threat to the structural integrity of the gate system. So there was an urgency that we needed to deal with in terms of how to stabilize this before the remarkably well-preserved structure of the gate was destroyed by collapse. Kind of lingering after effect, if you will, from the tunneling activity of ISIS back a decade ago. So we were very fortunate, and it was a new experience for us as archaeologists. We weren't really equipped technologically and in terms of experience to deal with something like this, but we were able to work with the United Nations Development Program. They said, we don't do cultural heritage, but after looking at the situation, they agreed with our assessment and said they would get involved, and so they became involved. And about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, they came in with a team, stabilized the whole structure, and then we employed about 40 local Maslawis to take the dirt from the dump we had assembled of the dirt ISIS had extracted from these tunnels to fill them with sandbags, and to backfill all this network of tunnels, and ultimately to stabilize the gate system. So that was the second challenge, was to stabilize everything. The third challenge then was to actually clear it out, clean it, and conserve it, and also study it. And this is where the point of trying to bring together both, let's say, pure exploratory archaeological discovery on the one hand, but also conservation and restoration, and ultimately the possibility of presentation of the site to the public might be possible. So we began doing that mostly with some very limited excavations in 2022. And you can see us beginning to clear out. This is from inside the gate looking to the east, beginning to clear out the enormous overburden of mud brick slump that had melted over the years. Much of it mud brick built and put here in the 1960s during the Saddam era, when they were trying to build these impressive superstructures. And so you see here some slides. And one of the surprises for us on this point about archaeological exploration was, in fact, that as we got down onto the pavements and above the pavements of the main street that runs through the gate system, we started to find intact archaeological remains, intact archaeological deposits. So we were not, and also structures that are largely in situ or in place, which meant that we could begin to map this in and develop a very high precision reconstruction or documentation of the gate system itself. But also, as you might see if I can use the arrow here. I'm not sure, not able to get it. But basically, for about a meter above the stone pavement, those deposits are actually intact, sort of true archaeological deposits. They predate the work of ISIS, and they predate the work of the 1960s. And even in the case, if you can see, there's some cut orthostats on the right here. We believe that goes back to the time of Layard and Rassam, and we don't know exactly who is the culprit, but they hacked through some of the orthostats. And you can see that cut mark, and there's thousands of little chips that they left behind. So there is a lot of damage above that. But in that sort of meter below that, the archaeological deposits essentially take us back directly to the period of the Neo-Assyrian construction and occupation of the city. So here's a bit of a plan to give you a bit of an update of what I'm talking about. And here's a composite reconstruction, and the part I want to highlight here is, as you're coming in from, this is again from the west to the east, moving into the central passageway of the gate, and on the back sort of left side there is a section, a stratigraphic profile, if you will, of the deposits going into one of the side chambers. And it was in this area. Here's a close-up of what I'm talking about. You can see the collapse. This is intact, if I can put it that way, collapse from the time of the destruction of Nineveh in the late 7th century, probably specifically from the time of the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. And so we're actually coming down, as you come down onto the floors, coming into pristine kind of primary context for archaeologically what might have been preserved in that catastrophic conflict and the collapse and termination of the city during the fall of Nineveh. And in fact, that's what we've got here. And here's a slide that tries to illustrate that in that deposit we have found human remains that are articulated, and it's a full spectrum of adults, males, adult females, adolescents, and even infants. So it's a mixed population. These are not necessarily soldiers and combatants. These are people probably fleeing the conflagration. We also found more than 100 fragments thus far of a stela, and also lots of arrowheads and other kind of weaponry, clearly from that conflagration. Here is some of the fragments. We are now in the early stages of trying to sort of put this stela back together again. It involves dealing with very soft stone, kind of gypsum, and cleaning the accretions that have accumulated on the surface is really difficult. And it's going to be take us a little bit of time, but already work has begun to be not only able to restore it, but actually to read it, if you will. And so the epigraphic work that's going on right now has already begun to identify quite a lot about this stela. The lead epigrapher is Gianni Marchesi, Italian scholar, and we can already confidently identify this, and I'm kind of pleased to say this in light of comments earlier, of Ashurbanipal. And some of the phrases that are preserved on the legible parts that have been read thus far bring up some of the events of his reign, including references to Taharqa, the campaigns against Egypt, that while we can't precisely date the stela yet, clearly puts it into the sort of latter part of probably to the latter part of his reign. And so here we have a pretty exciting discovery, not something we had anticipated, and it drives home the point how if you do this kind of good work, good careful excavation, even in these conservation restoration projects, you can often find yourself making some pretty exciting and even I would say perhaps sensational discoveries. Here's more fragments. So what are we looking at here? We're probably looking at something like the Esarhaddon stela / statues that you see illustrated on the right there. And we have fragments that are clearly including parts of the dress of, in this case, probably a representation of Ashurbanipal. Early going, but the other part we're doing is using sort of the latest technologies, not only conserving and cleaning them, but then creating three-dimensional high-resolution images of these fragments. And then our team continues to work on this material sort of year-round. They can take that digital imagery and work on it in the comforts of their own labs or homes, and beginning to piece together some of the inscription even as we go. And so you see that kind of work ongoing here. So that's very much, happening as I speak, and is something that's ongoing. And we hope to make a lot more reports and presentations of this material as it is better studied and conserved and studied and then published. Our work continues. The last part on this example is the work that's probably the most daunting, and that is these enormous side chambers and towers. The height of the material, as you might be able to sort of get a sense here, is something in the order of maybe 30 or more, maybe even meters or more. It's an enormous elevation from the street level, if you will, up to the top. And there are hints. Can't say that I'm right yet about this emphatically, but there are hints in the upper parts of the side chambers to suggest that we might have intact vaulting. So the point I'm getting at is that we actually might have intact, from roof to floor, chambers of this fortification system, which is pretty mind-blowing if you think about it, since we're talking about something that is close to 3,000 years old. So we are beginning to work down into some of these side chambers. You can see in this drone images the mud brick. That's not the mud brick of the 1960 reconstructions of the of Tariq Madloum. This is actually the original Neo-Assyrian towers, probably constructed during the reign of Sennacherib, which is most likely the person that the king that was involved with a lot of this kind of expansion of the defensive system. Here you see that work going on in the North Tower. We found also more human remains out in the sort of plaza on the west side of the gate. Here's a decapitated adult figure that you see here on the slide or image on the right. And that is found here to the west of the entrance into the gate system itself. And it, as a very quick, brief analogy or comparison, brings back to the work of the Stronach team from Berkeley, who did excavations at the Halsey Gate, which is actually just a few hundred meters south of the Shamash Gate on this eastern wall line, where they were able to, over 2 seasons in about, I think, 1989 or 1990, reconstruct much of the gate. And they found also very similarly, large numbers of sort of mass bodies from almost certainly the same conflict, the 612 destruction of Nineveh. They also found another very interesting element, which is a narrowing of the gate system that seems to have been something done in this very late period, perhaps during the reign of Ashurbanipal, and we have found something similar to that as well. We've also been doing other sort of more mundane archaeological work, which is documenting all the other material culture, including pottery, and all of these things help to build a much more precise picture, including a relative chronological profile for the context that we're excavating, including this pottery, which all falls very nice and neatly into this late 7th century context. We were just there in the fall, and here again, my colleague Steve Batchik, he's going to kill me for throwing this slide in, but he's trying to pose with yet another articulated skeleton human remains that we have found as we've continued to move eastward through the center of the gate system. So this, as I said, takes us up to the present. And here, it's, again, something none of us have ever, I've never in all my decades of fieldwork dealt with quite with this kind of depth. You can see some of the mud brick walls and arches of these going into these side chambers, some of them partially intact, some of them partially collapsed. We're going to be trying to figure out how to not only excavate but stabilize and then ultimately to preserve all of this monumental gate system going forward. And it's not quite sure how we're going to do that yet, but you can see here at least we've begun that exercise. And we've temporarily put roofing over this to try and preserve it because the winter rains and so on quickly erode most of what we uncover. And that has led to the last part of this project, the current part, where our partnership working with the municipality, with the governorate and the State Board of Antiquities, the community is very keen to develop this area into a public park. And this gets back to my points about the survey that was conducted in that article I mentioned at the outset of my presentation, where having not only a way of preserving the archaeological remains, and in this case, we're talking about creating something like a buffer that runs along the eastern wall line of the ancient site, but at the same time having a kind of dual purpose, which is creating a public space that can ultimately be a park, parkland and available and accessible to the community, a place where families can go in the evenings, kids can play, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is some plans, and one of the most remarkable parts of my experience in these last few years is the pace with which this is happening, because these plans were only developed in consultation with us about less than 2 years ago, and here I can show you some slides of what's happening right now. In less than a year or so, the commitment has been made to actually begin to develop this whole area, and these are slides from just in the last couple weeks, showing the work to come in and clear out a lot of the garbage and refuse that had accumulated here, and then to begin the landscaping work to convert this space into a public park. And if any of you ever get to Mosul, I encourage you to drive along the highway that runs north-south just to the east of the fortifications. Already, as you see in this slide here, they've been able to landscape part of that. And if you go there in the evenings, in particular during the, let's say, the summer months, when it's particularly hot outside, and this place is just full of people gathering. There'll be little kiosks, as you might be able to see, people selling popcorn and cotton candy and you name it. It's just a great environment that kind of helps bring the community together and alive in this densely urban environment. So it's a really gratifying thing to see how these two goals, the preservation, conservation of the site as an important cultural heritage landmark, and at the same time making it a public space that's accessible and has this positive impact on the community. And related to that, some of my most compelling experiences have been our engagement with the local community, whether they are people from the State Board of Antiquities or from the university. I like pointing out particularly the slide of this young female student. What she's doing is actually reading and translating part of the cuneiform inscription on the back side of one of these orthostats. And you can't hear it, but she's exclaiming with excitement as she compares with her textbook from the classes where she's studying Akkadian at the university and able to read this. And it's just a powerful example of this kind of connection and engagement that's had between the current, let's say, new generation and their engagement and interest and passion for this incredible cultural heritage of ancient Assyria. Now, I just want to make sure I still have time because I want to give a second quick example. Yes, I think I have a few more minutes to completely geographically shift gears to another project that I've been involved in the plain of Antioch or Antakya in southeastern Turkey, more or less right on the border with Syria, northwestern Syria. Specifically, you can see this area here in what's known as in ancient times, the plain of Antioch, contemporarily the Amuk plain, Amik Ovasi in Turkish, where we've been working for almost 25 years and working on sites that actually were part of the Institute's original fieldwork back in the 1930s. And we resumed work there starting more or less around 2000 and have been working there continuously over the past 25 years. So as I mentioned, the Syrian Hittite expedition did large-scale excavations at the site of Tayinat. Here you see illustrated something almost like straight out of an Indiana Jones movie from 1935 to about 1938. Large teams, hundreds of people, etc., and uncovered what we typically associate with the Neo-Hittite, not Neo-Assyrian period, shows strong Anatolian Hittite cultural connections. But what we hadn't really expected was that on top of that cultural horizon, we've found remarkably well-preserved remains from a Neo-Assyrian presence when the site was turned into a local provincial capital in the larger Neo-Assyrian Empire. So we began working there, as I said, around roughly around 2000, and this shows you a map of the areas that we've been working. And the part I want to focus on, just for the few minutes that I have left, is in an area that sort of attaches on to the larger scale excavations you saw in the earlier photograph from the 1930s excavations of the then Oriental Institute. And we wanted to go down to try and see if it can resolve long-standing questions around, important but perhaps somewhat mundane questions around stratigraphy, etc. And we came down on part of a temple, which of course is always exciting, but was for us completely unexpected. And I'll come back to the temple in just a minute, but to try and get around the temple, which you see in the sort of mid part of the slide here, but the oval that you see in the top of the slide is an area to the south that we opened up starting in around 2011, 2012 to try and work around the temple when we stumbled upon a whole series of spectacular sculptures, including this pristine, virtually untouched or scratched stone lion sculpture you can see for scale. This is like, we're talking roughly about 1.5 meters, a little over 1 meter in height, 1.5 meters in length. This is an enormous carved lion. And over the next few field seasons, we've now found more than half a dozen, not just animal or mythical creatures, but also human representations, including this representation of a Neo-Hittite king, specifically Shupililiuma. This is not the focus of my talk, so I won't go into the details of it, but on the backside of on his backside, there is a long inscription carved in what we call hieroglyphic Luvian that is part of the Anatolian language of this culture, this Neo-Hittite culture, that talks about his sort of autobiographical accomplishments and identifies him as the king Shupililiuma. The most recent one that we found was in the area that you can see with the red circle. It found part of a female statue you see illustrated here. And in her case, she had been systematically defaced in antiquity And we've been collecting now close to 8,000 fragments. You can see here the grid, the fine grid, as we were extracting this material from on the site, trying to gather all the fragments together. And we're in the process of trying to essentially sort of put her and these other sculptures back together. But the connection here that brings us to our Assyrian interest is that there is this, I like to use this slide of a scene on a unfortunately now lost orthostat from the Palace of Sargon at Khorsabad that is really focusing on other details, but sort of down in the lower part of the scene there are, and it's a bit blurry on the slide, but there are a number of soldiers who are systematically chiseling out parts of a statue or an orthostat that they have removed from its context. And what we can say with some confidence is that in the process of conquering this region, in a rather sophisticated way, the Assyrians kind of built another layer onto the cultural landscape of this region. So first, just to finish a very interesting little side note on the sculptures, and then I'll come and finish my point on this Neo-Assyrian sort of practice. And you see the female statue here, and again, it seems like I have a lot of pictures of Steve this afternoon, but you see him, Steve Batchik, that is, working with 3D modeling, shape matching work that we've been doing, trying to put these thousands of fragments back together, and also using PXRF to try and see if we can use chemical composition as another tool to group all these fragments. But one of the things we hadn't expected was that the work of the 1930s expedition also found hundreds of fragments, and those material are here in Chicago. And here's an example of one piece that somebody said, wait a minute, might that piece fit with our female statue that we're trying to put back together? And using 3D imaging, and then later a 3D print, we found other fragments, including the hand here, but I won't linger on that piece. But we found that this piece, imaging, using our 3D imaging, fit onto the chest of the statue that we have found. And what you're looking at there is one of her breasts, but also, quite remarkably, we hadn't initially recognized, is the first person singular, first person pronoun, I. You can't really know it unless you know your hieroglyphic Luvian, but just to the left of her hand there's a little bit of a sign. And in fact, it's the beginning of another section of an inscription. It's the beginning of her own articulation, let's say her autobiographical expression of who she is. So we haven't yet found her name, but I can tell you that once we found this piece, the intensity of trying to work through those thousands of fragments to see if we can't find more pieces that might actually bring us more of the inscription and ultimately perhaps her name has rejuvenated some of this ongoing work. Here you can see, just for those of you who are interested in hieroglyphic Luvian, another inscription from Syria. And if you look very carefully in the register, you can see this sort of human face with a hand that looks like it's pointing towards their mouth. And that's the hand that's preserved on that little sliver of the fragment that's just to the left of her breast and her hand there in that image that we've been able to confirm fits not only through 3D shape matching, but also through a 3D print that we brought to Turkey, and we're able to connect with the material from the new ongoing excavations. So the point of departure then is that we've found now half a dozen and many fragments of still to be found sculptures from this Neo-Hittite horizon, cultural horizon, that were systematically buried into pits that were dug into part of a monumental gate system that led up to this royal citadel in this period. And we can speak with some confidence that this was part of a kind of cultural masking or superposition that we can date almost certainly to the Neo-Assyrian period. And just one other digression here. We've begun to reconstruct in this kind of ritual landscape that's very interesting for, again, the study of the Neo-Hittite city and with ceremonial processional ways and so forth. But that's a conversation for another day. What we can do is that we can place this depositing of these statues and fragments into a very specific historical context. Because we know in 738, in the second Western campaign of Tiglath-Pileser, that he conducted a campaign against the city of Kunulua, and we've been able to positively identify Tayinat as ancient Kunulua, not just from archaeological evidence, but epigraphic evidence, including inscriptions that we have now found on these sculptures that name the site. So there's just no ambiguity about that historical connection. And we can then place that horizon that we have now found in the form of these deposited sculptures into this context from 738 and following. And I don't mean it to be just a negative, because what we have not realized is that there's actually was quite a lot of material found in the 1930s, and now our own excavations have found some pretty dramatic new evidence to show how the Assyrians integrated this region into their larger imperial realm. So I'll finish with that by first showing a few quick slides of elements that weren't fully understood or recognized going back to the early excavations that we can now say clearly were part of this Neo-Assyrian provincial phase or presence at the site when Kunulua was transformed into the site of Kinalia, the provincial capital of this province that had been established either by Tiglath-Pileser after he conquered the region, or perhaps by Sargon or one of the succeeding Assyrian kings. We're still debating that historical point. Here are some architectural elements, Building 10 and part of Gateway 7. Those of you who've been down to the museum will, at ISAC, will perhaps recognize these so-called provincial-style orthostats that were found in that Gateway 7 area, clearly from the Assyrian horizon. Also, largely unpublished, are traces of part of what was clearly a governor's residence or palace from this Assyrian, Neo-Assyrian context. You see these different elements highlighted here. I won't take time to explain them all in detail, but they're hallmarks of the style of reception suite for these provincial governor's residences or meeting houses that were established throughout the Assyrian Empire. But we've also got other monuments that I have to say, as a director of ISAC now, it's a little bit hard to admit, but really important artifacts, both art historically but also epigraphically, that still haven't been published after all these years, including this remarkable piece that we're referring to as the Golden Rondelle, that has remarkable art historical elements, but on the gold foil on this watercolor painting, which is about the best documentation we have at the moment, is part of an inscription that makes reference to part of the royal name of Tiglath-Pileser III. So amazing epigraphic connections to the historical context that I'm just alluding to. There are also other fragments from the original excavations, and then we have found other more recent pieces that, although heavily weathered, nevertheless have extensive text that we think are probably part of another stela. And my colleague Jacob Launger, working with Steve Batchik, have proposed that, in fact, instead of an Esarhaddon stela, we may be, in this case, looking at a Sargon stela. They published that recently. But here's the basic sort of concept, if we can use the parallels that have been found at Zingerli, for example. So the last piece I have here, just a few minutes to wrap up, is perhaps the most exciting part of our own ongoing excavations and research has been the discovery of this temple that I mentioned. And we can now say with confidence that this is part of a kind of sacred space or precinct, if you will, that matches with a temple that was first excavated in the 1930s, referred to as Building 2. We've designated this new building as Building 16. They face perpendicularly onto a large open space, probably a paved plaza, if you will. And in the inner parts of the temple, you can maybe see part of, in the very back, this sort of cella or Holy of Holies, if you will, is an elevated pavement, and scattered throughout this area were pieces of a whole lot of material, metal, silver, gold, bronze, iron, but in mostly tiny little scraps. This building was burned so intensively that the superstructure, mud brick that collapsed, fused and vitrified with parts of the lower intact walls. It was so hot, which means that we don't find a lot of intact artifacts, but we find little kind of shrapnel-like pieces of them, which gives us something of a hint of just how rich and remarkable the interior of this modest building, it's about 20 meters in length, would have been in its day. But on that back podium, we found a whole toolkit or paraphernalia related to ritual activity, jugs, lamps, and also these collar pins that were probably to hold suspended objects, if not maybe curtains or otherwise, which initially kind of eluded us why that was significant. And now close with that point or question in a minute. Close up on one of the more beautiful pieces, again, badly damaged by the burn, by the fire, this beautifully glazed basin, a very classic Assyrian glazedware basin, which has, you can't quite see it in the slide on the upper right, but you can see an alternating row of bulls and rosette patterns. And then in the midst of all of that Assyrian material culture was this very Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian artifact, a pyxis, that has part of the ancestral or mortuary feasting scene carved on it, a small little basalt piece you can see for scale. So there's a mixing going on here, and this is the kind of part I want to close with, is that the Assyrian conquest of Tayinat wasn't just this kind of brutal, violent, destructive exercise. They very decisively reframed and reshaped the identity and the kind of focus, and including the religious focus of the elite part of the site. But they didn't just simply wipe it all out, and they incorporated local, and this piece, I think, illustrates the incorporation of long-standing local traditions, including religious traditions, but then established kind of their own layer to that. And here's how it is most dramatically illustrated. On that inner pavement or podium in the cella, we found a whole series of tablets, cuneiform late Assyrian tablets. Most of them are kind of mundane texts, if we can say that about an Assyrian tablet. And they look like this, referred to as Ikor Ipush texts. They're omen or hemorrhagical texts, kind of like a spreadsheet, if I can put it that way, with various kinds of activities or eventualities on the vertical column, and then months of the year on the horizontal column. And you can perhaps see where I'm going with this, identifying which is the optimal month. When do we start the planting season? When do we harvest? When do we build the annex onto the back of our house? When do we get married, perhaps? These are the kinds of documents that were found in this inner cella. But initially people said, well, you found an archive, you found, like a library perhaps of reference tools or texts that those documents are part of. But the person who's been working on this material, Jacob Lauinger, I think made and recognized early on a very important point, that these artifacts, because we found them in situ, in context, clearly in this religious cultic environment, these were objects of display more than they were simply informational content on rules and guidelines for ritual practice. And that's most heavily made by this remarkable discovery, which is the largest piece, and you can see for scale, it's about roughly 30 centimeters in width, about 40 some centimeters in length. It's sort of like your Metro newspaper, if you will, or Sun-Times, if I can now use a Chicago analogy, in size. But it's a very dense document, 700 some lines of text, and most of it, again, sort of mundane, long lists of curses and blessings and so forth. But at the beginning of the text, it names who the document is being directed towards, and it's the local leadership, the governor and the administration of the Assyrian province, and it's sealed on the backside. And here we actually have preserved part of the colophon that dates it right down to the day, although unfortunately this little chip is right where the day is. So it's either the 16th day or the 18th day, but we'll take it because we can say that it was in the second month of the year in our own modern calendar of the year 672. And that's in and of itself a remarkable discovery, but what's even more interesting is what happened in 672. And those of you in this room who know your Assyrian history might know that that was a particularly auspicious year when Esarhaddon assembled to the royal court in Nimrud vassals and princes and all of the leadership and elite of the empire, and bound them in a loyalty oath that when he passed, his chosen successor, Ashurbanipal, would be the recognized ruler. And the fact that this document is found in a temple context in our provincial context is in and of itself also remarkable. And I don't want to take more time because there's an enormous amount of literature already that has been generated studying this, including biblical scholars who have recognized lots of parallels with some of the texts in the Mosaic covenant code in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And here you see fragments that were found in the actual context of where probably these ceremonies took place at Nimrud back in Assyria. And these were found during the excavations in the 1950s. To finish then, our discovery found not only these texts, but as were recognized by Jacob Lauinger, there were perforations that indicated that they had a kind of amuletic feature. They were suspended, they were on display. They had this kind of ritual component in addition to the information content that they preserved. And all of that material is on this podium in the inner sanctuary of this temple. And just to try and make the connection back to Nimrud and to the Assyrian context, here you see now the two temples together facing perpendicularly onto the central space. And it's remarkable because not only the style of the temple, but also the contents that we found in the room, even right down to the range or genre of tablets, including, as you see here, the two temples. In this case, they're parallel rather than perpendicular, but across the courtyard is a room with tablets, and if you go and look at the list of tablets from that room, it almost perfectly replicates the range of tablets that we found at the Tayinat example. And it's above this in this other building where there's a reception suite, just like the example from Tayinat, where those fragments of the Esarhaddon succession treaties or oath tablets were found that I just illustrated on the photograph. And lastly, if we take the example of similarly the temples from the temple of Nabu at Khorsabad or Shurukun, you can see here the exact parallels with the perpendicular plan. So there's no question that they were replicating, albeit on a slightly smaller scale, the kind of religious context that we have from Assyria and the imperial court of these royal cities. And I won't go into, because of time, breakdown of all these pieces, but we've begun to realize that there's an entire settlement, an entire horizon or profile of the city, of the site, that dates to this Neo-Assyrian provincial phase that we can now kind of piece together. And it in many ways replicates the kind of combination of functional units, courtyard buildings, temples, palaces, etc., that we see reflected in the plan of the citadel at Dur Shurukun or Khorsabad. And the last part of this, that's perhaps the most exciting, as Jacob Lauinger has tried to better understand the spatial context of these tablets and of this material culture that we found on this podium, he's identified a series of texts, Neo-Assyrian texts, referred to loosely as the Covenant of Ashur, that describe ritual activities related to the annual Akitu ceremony. And what was kind of like a eureka moment when he realized this, and he kind of emails me and says, Tim, you got to look at this. The ritual activities that are identified is kind of like a how-to manual, if we could put it that way, these texts. And they describe the activities related to this Akitu ceremony. The various rituals directly parallel the assembled toolkit that we found on the podium, the jars, the lamps, and so forth. Each of those were related to very specific rituals that are described in this text. So we've been able to kind of bring together all of this different lines of evidence and can actually reconstruct with a high degree of confidence the actual ritual activities that were going on here and how that fit into this larger imperial project of the Assyrians in this very specific historical context of the mid to late 7th century. So I'll stop with that And just thank you for your patience, and again for the opportunity to come here and talk about these 2 different examples of ongoing recent discoveries on the archaeology of Syria.